Hi there, and welcome to my channel. You look great today. Now today we're going to be doing an in-depth dive of the famed podcaster Joe Rogan and discussing, is Joe Rogan evil? Or is he just confused? The reason I want to pose this question is that recently there's been a new outburst of controversy from his episode on the 4th of March, where he commented on trans people and made some pretty transphobic comments. And this isn't the first time that he's been embroiled in a controversy like this. He's made other comments about trans people in the past. He's also talked about COVID-19 misinformation as if it were true. And I want to get to the bottom of who he is and what his content promotes. Now, if you're a super Joe Rogan fan who's going to be offended by this video, you don't have to watch it at all. You can leave. But if you're a Joe Rogan fan who's willing to sort of hear me out, I just want to discuss whether Joe Rogan is at his core someone with very bad views who should kind of not be so promoted and spreads difficult influences to lots of people, or if he's just sort of there, a passive watcher, and doesn't realize what he's doing. Now, spoiler for the end of this video, I'm not going to say that Joe Rogan is evil. I know that the whole point of a YouTube video like this is to get to the end and come to the conclusion there, but I'm going to say right away, Joe Rogan's not evil. No one is evil. And it's fine to like who you want to like, but I want to get to the bottom of whether he has the terrible opinions that I see as very dangerous, or if they just happen because he's been doing his podcast for so long and so frequently for so long that they just sort of happen and he moves on. So to start us off, we're going to look at what I saw coming up on my feed, which were clips from the episode he released on the March the 4th, in which he shared some pretty yikesy transphobic views. So, Joe Rogan was doing his podcast like he does every single day, 12 million times a day for the last 240,000 years, and he had his guest on called Steve-O, and Steve-O mentioned a trans person talking about not being allowed into the bathroom of their associated gender. Joe Rogan interrupted with this and said that that's not true, and it's not that they're not allowed to go into the bathroom they're comfortable in, it's that they're not allowed to go to the bathroom that doesn't agree with their biological sex. Now, the bathroom's point is old, and I'm kind of sick of it. If you want to, after this video, you could watch my video on J.K. Rowling, who sort of started that whole conflict in the zeitgeist. He not only said this, but he also said a few pretty disgusting comments. He continued on this tangent saying that letting trans people discuss the gendered bathroom argument is like giving them a Willy Wonka golden ticket to attacking women. Now, this is obviously quite a horrible thing to say, and it spread that general social view on trans people as a danger to cis women, and he then also went on to say they had something called autogynephilia. Now, this was a debunked scientific claim. More on that later. He really likes to sort of make claims that are completely against science and most scientists, and he also said that trans people are the majority of shooters in America this year. Yes, that's right. He claimed that trans shooters have killed more people than ICE this year, which is not true and also not true, and also really, really horrible and dangerous to say. Trans people are a minority. I am a big ally to the trans community, and I think that targeting them like this is a real problem. Now, aside from these things and also calling trans women creeps, this isn't the first time that Joe Rogan has been involved with controversy to do with the transgender community. In 2022, Joe Rogan commented on Leah Thomas, who is a trans swimmer, and said that she might be the woke straw that broke the camel's back, which is a really cringy thing to say, but I guess that if you have 7 million podcast episodes, you run out of the order of words to say, and you just start forming really horrible sentences. He also said to another transgender person called Fallon Fox, and I will have to completely paraphrase this because it was full of expletives and not YouTube friendly, which is also maybe something you shouldn't say to a minority, because if it's not YouTube or family friendly, then maybe it's just not friendly to them at all. Said that if at one point you were biologically determined as a man, then you still are. And if you had the bone structure that comes with that, then you are a man. Now, this isn't true, and I know that most people who are Joe Rogan fans who are watching this video probably don't care what I'm saying, and they probably agree, because that sort of demographic aligns greatly. Joe Rogan and discrimination, I feel like, isn't too mad a link to make, since he is a heterosexual white man with a podcast. And yet, I am going to point out that biological sex is not the same as gender, because some people are born with different biological sex to the gender they're associated with, and it's a societal norm that is just pushed on people arbitrarily. Going back to that scientific debunked thing, there's also a huge controversy back in COVID days when he spread COVID-19 misinformation. In 2021, Joe Rogan tested positive for having COVID. And he posted this and said that he was starting his own medical regime using different monoclonal antibodies that most scientists then came out and said will not stop the spread of the COVID-19 virus. This became a controversy not just because he was spreading misinformation, because people generally don't seem to care if you spread misinformation on the internet. It drew controversy because several people were hospitalized after dosing themselves with this over-the-counter medicine that is actually used to treat livestock, because he suggested that it would cure them of the disease. Now that's really messed up, and I think that we should all be able to agree that that's messed up, especially now that COVID is behind us. If you were an anti-vaxxer, you could probably just admit now that the vaccine did work, but if you don't want to, fine. You probably still agree that people shouldn't just take random medications to try and fix the illness themselves. I hope. And the episode was also generally criticised for promoting conspiracy theories, which is where we start to get into this question. Is Joe Rogan a bad guy, or is he just sort of letting things passively happen on his podcast? Because the guest on that podcast not only spread some conspiracy theories, but also talked about the government enforcement on getting the vaccine, which was to save lives and stop people from dying, as comparable to the Holocaust. Now that's very messed up again, and though Joe Rogan didn't specifically come out and say, in that episode, I completely agree with you and we have the exact same opinion, I do find that there's quite a pattern between Joe Rogan podcasts where the guest will come on and say anything they like and he will not protest enough. Now, yes, if you are a podcaster, you don't have to explicitly disagree and argue and debate with people on your podcast, because sometimes that just leads to kind of a negative and infuriating watch for a lot of your viewers. There's so many podcasts out there that are so stupid, like the Whatever podcast, where they just bring people on and argue with them for an hour. So I appreciate that Joe Rogan isn't always doing that. But if you have people on who talk about science, but aren't themselves scientists, which is going to happen because he's made so many podcasts, then you should protest or make it clear that this is not scientifically backed, or you're not sure if they're right about that, or simply just put it out there in the label of the episode. This episode contains some things that we don't agree with, or you should do your own research, or you should check a government website because they're the ones with all the information. The government sucks, okay? The government does suck, and I admit to that, and I agree with that. But the government isn't the one who's tricking you and fooling you in the way that conspiracy theorists think. The way they're fooling you is by getting all your money. They're not lizard people. They're not giving you a vaccine so that there's a microchip in you. Microchips wouldn't fit in a vaccine. They're not all working for Bill Gates. The government just wants money for themselves. The vaccine had nothing to do with that. They wanted the pandemic over as much as anyone did. Now, this isn't to say that Joe Rogan hasn't ever said some good things. In fact, there are some things he said that I agree with, which is also why this muddies the waters so much. Because in 2025, he expressed his disregard for how Trump's administration is handling America, which again, all of us should be able to agree on. He commented on the fact that the Epstein files as a situation was dealt with very badly, mentioning that it's strange that they didn't just release them. He seems to have maybe missed the point that Trump isn't releasing them because he's definitely in them and he's a criminal. He didn't explicitly say Trump was a criminal, but he did say that he doesn't agree with Trump so much. Problem with this is, I can't really take it at face value because Joe Rogan was also a huge supporter of Trump in the 2024 election. Without his support, Trump may have not gotten into power. And if Trump hadn't gotten into power, the world would not be perfect, but it would be a lot better off than it is now, because America is suffering under his regime. Joe Rogan has also expressed his concern over the Israel and Gaza conflict at the moment, and in a podcast episode described it as a genocide, which is what it is. And as someone with such a big platform, I was extremely thankful to find out that he had done this. However, in a podcast episode 8 days later, he had a guest on called Coleman Hughes, who disagreed with the fact that it was a genocide, and Joe Rogan decided to say, "You probably know more about it than I do," and gave up his point. So this is the other thing. Even when Joe Rogan makes some really good points, I do find that sometimes he lets them go at the drop of a hat, the snap of a finger. If his guest even slightly suggests something, he will agree with it immediately, whatever it is. And that's dangerous, because people are watching Joe Rogan and listening to Joe Rogan. If you've got a platform like you do, and you're going to let yourself be so easily swayed by probably the worst types of people if they're trying to sway you and use your platform, then you need to be really careful, because otherwise you end up with more situations like this one. Joe Rogan also described Vladimir Putin's rule over Russia as evil, but also said that he was a clearly strong man. And again, I think when you have an audience, a fan base that is such a male audience, you need to be careful with promoting different toxic masculinity styles, because it's very dangerous and it could hurt a lot of people. Which brings me to the conclusion of this video, which is that from a non-male perspective, I have sort of vaguely observed Joe Rogan for a long time. I've never seen a Joe Rogan episode. I've only seen sort of clips, because I think I'd probably lose my mind if I had to watch one. And it seems like, to me, the premise of his podcast is fake. Because the point of his podcast is that he has guests on and he hears about their opinions and he lets them say what they want to say and then he moves on. But the issue is he's had so many guests on now, and what happens is if you let anyone on, they say their conspiracy theories and you don't protest. He doesn't protest with his guests, he just lets them say the things. And this is what causes controversy, because your platform, whether it's you saying the things or not, is big enough that those ideas are going to be spread. So no, you didn't directly agree with your guest, but your guest said it and millions of people heard it. And that itself is dangerous. Joe Rogan isn't evil. Joe Rogan might be confused, because I think maybe what's happening is that he believes his podcast's premise works soundly. He lets people on, he lets people have their free speech, and then he moves to the next episode. He's clearly making a lot of money, which is fine, good for him, but it may have gotten to his head, not in the sense that he's corrupt from his money, but just in the sense that this seems like the normal business order of things. These things happen and they lead to these things. And maybe you agree with that. Maybe you think that his podcast is fairer than most podcasts because he just lets his guests say whatever they want. But I disagree, because I think that you have a responsibility to mitigate what comes out of your podcast, what comes towards your fans and what doesn't. He's also expressed several opinions that I'm very much against. Like I said, his transphobia, which kind of just was a bit disgusting, and also general controversies that I haven't talked about in this video because I wanted it to be quite short and concise. But overall, he's probably not evil, but I do think he's a bad influence on most men of our time. So that's the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate the support. And also, we just hit 100 subscribers, which is amazing, and it all happened from the last video, which blew up. You could watch that after this. It's discussing what DC fans want, because they've also seemed kind of confused. Less evil, though. And I hope you had a great time. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more of my content, and leave a comment if you have something nice to say. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely week. Mwah.